I've always preferred hiking alone. It's not that I don't like people. I just like the quiet. There's something peaceful about moving through the woods with nothing but your own thoughts, away from the noise of the world. I've done dozens of solo hikes over the years, some short, some multi-day trips deep in the backcountry. I plan them carefully, pack light but smart, and always stick to my route. This one was supposed to be no different. I had picked a remote section of forest, an old trail that wasn't well traveled. It wasn't an official route anymore, just something that had been used years ago but had since fallen off the maps. I found it through an old hiking forum where people shared forgotten trails, places where you wouldn't run into anyone for miles. That's exactly what I wanted. I left my truck at the base of the trail just after sunrise. The morning air was crisp, and the sky was clear. Perfect hiking weather. My pack was snug on my shoulders, my boots were broken in, and I had my GPS, my compass, and a paper map just in case. The first few miles were easy. The trail was narrow but visible, winding through thick trees and following the curve of a ridge. I made good time, stopping only to drink water and check my bearings. The deeper I went, the more overgrown the path became, but I expected that. I had planned for it. What I hadn't planned for was what happened next. I was about 4 hours in when I noticed something strange. The trail I had been following just stopped. Not in the usual way where it fades into overgrowth and you have to pick your way through. This was different. One moment there was a clear path. The next, nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had walked here in years. I frowned, checking my GPS. Still showed I was on the right path. I pulled out my compass and double-checked my position. According to everything I had, I was still where I was supposed to be. But looking around, I could see that wasn't true. The forest didn't match my map. The ridge should have been on my right, sloping down toward a small river. But the land here was flat, dense with trees that weren't supposed to be this close together. Felt wrong. I turned back the way I came, thinking maybe I had veered off without realizing it. But after a few steps, I stopped. The trail was gone. Not overgrown. Not hidden. Just gone. My stomach tightened. I knew better than to panic. I had trained for this, read survival books, watched videos on how to handle being lost in the woods. Stay calm. Use your tools. Retrace your steps. I took a deep breath and pulled out my map again. If I couldn't find the trail, I could at least navigate back to my truck by following the terrain. I marked my last known location and picked a direction that should take me back to where I started. I walked and walked and walked, but nothing changed. The trees all looked the same, tall and straight, their trunks packed too close together. The ground was covered in thick underbrush that I didn't remember passing through earlier. No landmarks, no clearing, just endless forest stretching in every direction. I checked my GPS again, but now it was frozen. The screen showed my last location, but the tracker wasn't moving. I switched to my compass and adjusted my course, pushing through the thick brush. My breathing was steady, but I could feel my pulse creeping up. Then I saw something that made me stop. A tree stripped of its bark. At first, it didn't seem unusual. Trees get damaged. Whether animals, disease, it happens. But as I stepped closer, I saw the marks. Deep, precise cuts like something or someone had stripped the bark on purpose. The exposed wood underneath was fresh, the edges still raw. I swallowed hard. I wasn't alone out here. I kept moving, faster now, forcing my way through the dense brush. I had to get back to the truck. I had to get out. But the further I went, the more wrong everything felt. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic. The silence was unnatural. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing. Then I found the rope. It was stretched between two trees at chest height, nearly invisible against the bark. My foot caught it just as I saw it, and I stumbled forward, barely catching myself before hitting the ground. I stared at it, my heart pounding. It wasn't an accident. Someone had put it there. I spun around, scanning the trees, my skin crawling. Nothing. No movement. No sound. I was being hunted. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had led me off the trail. Someone had been waiting. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the map, the compass, the route. I just ran. Branches tore at my clothes. My pack bounced against my back. But I didn't stop. My legs burned. My lungs ached. But I pushed forward, crashing through the undergrowth, desperate to get away. Then I saw it. A figure, standing just ahead, half hidden behind the trees. Tall, motionless, watching me. I didn't stop to look. I veered left, sprinting downhill, my boots slipping on loose dirt. My breath came in ragged gasps, my vision blurred with sweat. I could hear something behind me, footsteps, fast, close. I broke into a clearing and nearly collapsed with relief. There, just beyond the trees, I could see the road, my truck. I didn't slow down. I sprinted across the gravel, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. My hands shook as I jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I hit the gas, tearing out onto the road, my tires kicking up dust. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just drove. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the highway, that I let myself breathe. My hands were still shaking, my shirt soaked with sweat. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing on the side of the road. But there was nothing, just empty forest. I don't know who was out there. I don't know how they led me off the trail. But I do know one thing. I'll never hike alone again. I had been hiking alone for years, always careful, always prepared. I wasn't reckless. I didn't take unnecessary risks. But none of that mattered when I found myself stranded, miles from the nearest road with no clear way back. I had planned a 2-day trip through a national forest, a loop trail that climbed a ridge, offering a long stretch of exposed rock before descending back into dense pine forest. The route was well documented, moderate in difficulty, and heavily used in summer. But I had come in the early fall, just after the peak season, when the air was crisp and the crowds were gone. I parked at the trailhead before sunrise, checked my gear, and started up the path. The first few miles were easy, wide dirt trails, gradual incline, the sound of distant birds in the trees. I fell into my usual hiking rhythm, my boots pressing into damp soil, the weight of my pack settling comfortably on my shoulders. The trail climbed steadily, the trees thinning as I gained elevation. After about 4 hours, I reached the ridge, a long, narrow stretch of exposed rock, sloping gently upward. I took a break, sitting on a boulder, drinking from my water bottle. The wind was stronger up here, carrying the sharp scent of pine and cold stone. I looked ahead. The trail followed the ridge for another few miles before dropping into a valley, where I planned to camp for the night. I kept walking. The path was easy to follow at first, marked by small cairns, stacks of rocks left by other hikers. But as I moved further along the ridge, the markers became less frequent. I didn't think much of it at the time. The terrain was open with good visibility, and I could see where the trail should be leading. Then the wind shifted. A low, heavy gust swept across the ridge, colder than before. The sky had darkened, not storm clouds, but a dull, flat gray. I stopped, checking my map. The terrain didn't match what I expected. The ridge seemed narrower than it should have been, the drop-off steeper. I turned back the way I came, and nothing looked familiar. The cairns were gone. The boulders I had passed earlier weren't there. It was just open rock, sloping downward on both sides, with no clear path. My pulse picked up. I wasn't lost. Not yet. I had a compass, I had my map. I had daylight. I moved carefully, picking my way back toward where I thought I had come from. But the terrain kept shifting. Small ridges and dips that hadn't been there before. I checked my map again, trying to orient myself. If I kept heading west, I would eventually hit the tree line, and from there I could find the trail again. I walked for over an hour. The trees never came. The landscape stretched endlessly in front of me. Barren rock, empty ridges. My legs ached from the uneven ground. My throat was dry, despite my water. Then I saw something ahead. First, I thought it was another cairn, a small stack of stones, slightly off balance. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a cairn at all. It was a pile of bones, not animal bones. My stomach clenched. I knelt, staring at them. The bones were old, yellowed, weathered by wind and rain. Some had been cracked as if by pressure. They were arranged in a rough circle, like someone had placed them there deliberately. I stood up, my breath coming fast. I turned, and I saw more, scattered across the rock in irregular intervals, small piles of bones, some barely visible under thin layers of dirt.
A femur, a shattered skull, a ribcage collapsed inward.
I backed away, my pulse hammering. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just someone who had gotten lost. This was something else. I turned sharply and kept moving. The wind had died completely. The air felt thick, heavy. My own footsteps sounded wrong against the rock. Too loud, too sharp. I needed to get off this ridge. I kept my pace steady, forcing myself not to run. I moved downhill, hoping to find a slope that would lead me back to the trees. But the ground kept tilting in ways that didn't make sense. Angles that felt wrong, dips that should have been climbs. Then I saw the cave, a narrow opening, barely visible in the rock face, partially hidden by a ledge. I hesitated. Every part of me screamed not to go near it. But I needed shelter. I needed a place to stop, to think. I stepped inside. The air was colder, damp. The space wasn't deep, just a small hollow in the rock, barely tall enough for me to stand. But the walls were covered in scratches. Deep, uneven gouges, overlapping each other in chaotic patterns. I stepped closer, running my fingers over them. They weren't random. They followed a pattern, a frantic repetition of shapes. Tallies, hundreds of them carved deep into the stone. I stumbled back, my breath quickening. I turned to leave, and outside the cave, less than 50 feet away, something moved. It was low to the ground, barely more than a shadow against the rock. Crawling, moving with deliberate, jerky motions. I didn't stop to look. I ran. I scrambled down the ridge, slipping on loose stone, my pack throwing me off balance. My knees hit the ground hard, pain jolting up my legs. I pushed forward, breath burning in my chest. The landscape blurred, rocks, dips, uneven ground. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Then trees. The moment I saw them, I sprinted. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping against my arms. My boots slammed into soft dirt. I kept going, running until my lungs felt like they would split. Then I collapsed. I lay there, gasping, my body shaking. The forest was silent, normal. I pulled out my map, my compass. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold them. But I wasn't lost anymore. I could find my way back. I walked for hours, refusing to stop. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting. I threw my pack inside, slammed the door, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I never reported what I found. I never told anyone about the bones, the scratches, the thing I saw, because I knew no one would believe me, and because I knew, somewhere out there, in the empty stretches of rock, in the places where the trail disappears, there are things you aren't supposed to find. And once you do, they don't let you go. I had been camping solo for years, ever since I was in my early 20s. Something about being out in the wilderness, away from the constant hum of civilization, made me feel grounded. It wasn't about adventure or pushing my limits. I just liked the quiet, the long stretches of silence, the smell of pine and damp earth, the distant sound of running water from a stream or lake. That year, I decided to camp out in a remote part of Montana. It wasn't an official campground, just a spot I found on a topographic map. A clearing by a lake, miles away from the nearest road, nestled between rolling hills and thick forest. It looked perfect. No tourists, no RVs, no campfire smoke from families roasting marshmallows. Just me, my tent, and the wild. The drive took most of the day. I parked my truck on the side of an old service road, unloaded my gear, and started hiking in. The trail was barely a trail at all, more like an old animal path that had been reclaimed by the forest. I had my GPS, a compass, and a paper map, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I'd done this plenty of times before. By late afternoon, I reached the spot. It was even better than I expected. A flat patch of ground near the lake, shaded by tall pines. The water was calm, barely rippling, reflecting the pale blue sky above. No signs of other campers, no trash, no broken branches from someone setting up before me. It felt untouched. I set up camp the way I always did, tent first, then the fire pit. I collected some dry wood, stacked it neatly, and made sure I had enough for the night. Once that was done, I sat by the lake and ate a quick dinner. The sun was starting to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the clearing. The air cooled the way it does in the mountains, and I pulled on a jacket. As the light faded, I started a small fire. I wasn't the type to sit around it telling stories or getting lost in thought. I just liked the warmth, the way it kept the night from creeping in too close. The forest was quiet, aside from the occasional rustling in the underbrush. Normal sounds, squirrels, maybe a deer moving through the trees. Nothing that put me on edge. But as I sat there, something started to nag at me. The feeling, the kind you can't explain. The kind that settles in your gut and makes your skin prickle, like being watched. I'd had it before on other trips, but it always passed. Usually, it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The isolation, the darkness, the way the trees seemed to press in when you were alone. I shook it off and focused on the fire. It wasn't like I was in bear country, at least not heavily. I'd taken precautions, kept my food sealed tight, and hung anything with a scent far from my tent. If anything was out there, it wasn't after me. The feeling didn't go away, though. At some point, I heard something, a snap, like a branch breaking underfoot, not far off, maybe 20 or 30 yards into the woods. I looked up, firelight flickering against the trees. Could have been anything, a raccoon, a fox, even a bird landing on a dead limb. But then there was another snap, closer this time. I stood up, scanning the dark. My flashlight was in the tent, but I didn't want to go fumbling for it. Instead, I grabbed a stick from the fire and lifted it, letting the glow stretch further into the trees. The underbrush was thick, shadows shifting with the light. Nothing moved. I waited, listening, my ears strained against the quiet, but the forest had gone still. Not even the insects were making noise anymore. After a minute, I lowered the stick and tossed it back into the fire. I told myself it was just an animal passing through, probably spooked by the fire, stopping to watch me the way animals sometimes do. Still, the feeling lingered. I let the fire burn down to embers before climbing into my tent. Zipped up the flap, laid down, and listened. The silence was heavy, but I forced myself to relax. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke up to something outside the tent. It wasn't loud, just the faintest sound of movement. A shuffling, slow, deliberate, right outside. I didn't move. My first thought was a bear. But bears don't move like that. They don't creep. They don't hesitate. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming it at the tent wall. A shadow moved, not an animal shape. Person. I shot up, heart hammering. I wasn't armed, not with a gun anyway, just a knife in my pack. My mind raced through options. Make noise? Stay quiet? Then the zipper moved. Not fast. Slow. Testing. I lunged forward and slapped my hand against it, shoving it back down. My pulse was a drum in my ears. Silence. Then footsteps. Walking away. Slow, unhurried. I waited until they faded completely. Then I unzipped the tent, just enough to peek out. The fire was still smoldering, casting a dull glow. The trees stood silent. Nothing moved. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. To first light, I packed up. Fast. Didn't bother with breakfast, didn't take my time. My hands were shaking as I shoved everything into my pack. As I was rolling up my tent, I noticed something. Footprints. Not boots. Bare feet. Leading from the treeline. Stopping right at my tent. Then turning back. I didn't follow them. I didn't want to know where they led. I hiked out faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. Didn't look back until I was on the road, miles away. I never reported it. What would I even say? But I never camped alone again. I moved into the house at the end of summer, in that stretch of time when the days were still long, but the evenings had a hint of fall creeping in. It was a small rental, plain and unremarkable, sitting at the end of a quiet street. A single-story house with 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a backyard that was mostly dirt and weeds. Nothing special, but it was affordable, and that was all that mattered to me. The previous tenant had left in a hurry. I could tell by the way certain things had been left behind. An old broom in the closet, a single chair in the garage, a roll of toilet paper still on the holder in the bathroom. The landlord didn't say much about it, only that the last guy had moved out suddenly and stopped answering calls. It didn't seem like my problem. First, everything was normal. I spent my days working from home and my evenings watching TV or scrolling on my phone. The house was old, and it made the usual noises, wood shifting as it settled, pipes clicking in the walls. Nothing that bothered me. Then I started waking up feeling strange. It wasn't just being tired. It was an exhaustion that sank deep into my body, like I hadn't really slept at all. My muscles ached, my back felt stiff, and my head was foggy. Some mornings, I found small bruises on my arms and legs, like I had been pressing against something hard in my sleep. I figured it was just from tossing and turning. Then, one morning, I found the front door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. It was a habit, something I always did before bed. But there it was, unlatched. I checked the house, looking for signs that someone had been inside. Nothing was missing, nothing was out of place. I convinced myself I must have forgotten. The next night, I double-checked. I locked the door, tested the handle, even stood there for a few seconds just to make sure. The following morning, it was unlocked again. I started feeling uneasy. Then there were the noises. First, they were soft. A faint creak in the living room while I was in bed. The sound of something shifting in the kitchen when I was in the shower. I told myself it was just the house settling, but I started paying more attention. One night, I woke up to a sound coming from the hallway. A slow, deliberate creak. I stayed still, barely breathing, straining to listen. Nothing. In the morning, I found the hall closet door open. I knew I hadn't opened it. I pushed it shut and moved on with my day, trying not to think about it. But things kept happening. Small things. My keys weren't where I left them. The kitchen drawer was slightly open. The light in the bathroom was on when I knew I had turned it off. Little things that didn't seem big on their own, but together, they started to wear on me. Then I started waking up with my blankets pulled off. Some nights, I would wake up shivering, my comforter bunched at the foot of the bed. Other times, it was gone completely, lying in the hallway outside my room. I started locking my bedroom door. But one morning, I woke up and found it unlocked. I tried to tell myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe I was so exhausted that I was forgetting things, moving things around without realizing it. Then I saw the attic hatch. It was in the hallway ceiling, just a small wooden panel with a pull-down cord. I hadn't thought about it much, hadn't even looked up at it since I moved in. But one day, I noticed it was slightly ajar, just a crack, enough to see darkness beyond it. I grabbed a chair and pushed it shut, making sure it was tight. The next day, it was open again. I felt sick. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every soft sound made my skin crawl. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft, steady noise. The sound of something moving above me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then silence. I lay there, heart hammering, until the sun came up. As soon as it was light, I grabbed my keys and left the house. I drove around for a while, trying to clear my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. I needed to know. I went to a hardware store and bought a long metal pole, the kind used to change light bulbs on high ceilings. When I got home, I stood beneath the attic hatch, gripping the pole in both hands, and pushed. The hatch lifted easily. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. Nothing. I reached up, hooked the pole into the latch and pulled. The hatch swung down, revealing a dark opening. I hesitated, then grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen. I aimed the beam into the attic. There wasn't much up there, just exposed beams, a thin layer of insulation, a few old boxes covered in dust. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then I saw the blankets. 3 of them laid out neatly in the corner. Next to them, an empty water bottle, a pile of food wrappers, and a small, worn-out shoe. I stood there, my mind struggling to catch up with what I was seeing. Someone had been living up there. Someone had been coming down at night. I backed away, my hands shaking. I left the house immediately and drove straight to a motel. I didn't go back until the landlord sent someone to check the attic. They found a small hole in the side of the house, just big enough for someone to squeeze through. The latch on the attic hatch had been loose. I moved out the next day. I never found out who had been up there. I didn't want to. I've camped alone more times than I can count. Some people think it's reckless, but I've always found peace in the solitude. There's something about being deep in the woods, miles from anyone else, that makes the world feel simpler.
No emails.
No traffic, just me, the trees, and the quiet. This trip was supposed to be like any other. I had planned for 3 nights out in the wilderness, far from any official campsites. I picked a spot deep in a national forest, far from trails, near a small creek. It was a perfect place. Plenty of firewood, fresh water, and total isolation. The first day went smoothly. I parked my truck on an old dirt road, hiked about 5 miles into the woods, and found a clearing big enough for my tent. The trees were thick on all sides, but there was just enough space for a fire pit and a decent view of the creek. I set up camp, gathered firewood, and cooked some simple food over the fire as the sun set. The air was cool, the smell of pine and damp earth strong. As darkness settled in, I sat by the fire, letting the warmth soak in. Nights in the woods can be unnerving if you aren't used to them. The silence isn't really silence. It's filled with distant rustling, the occasional snap of a branch, the wind moving through the trees. I've learned to tune it out. Most noises are just animals going about their business. That first night, I slept deeply, the steady sounds of the creek lulling me into unconsciousness. The second day was uneventful. I spent most of it exploring, hiking further upstream, fishing a little. The sun filtered through the trees. The scent of damp leaves filled the air, and I felt completely at peace. But as the sun started to dip, something felt different. At first, I couldn't pinpoint what it was. The air felt heavier, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. The woods were quieter than before. The usual evening sounds, chirping insects, rustling branches, felt more distant, like they were further away than they should be. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just imagining things. That night, as I sat by the fire, I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the darkness beyond the trees. Nothing was there. I forced myself to relax, but my body wouldn't listen. The hairs on my arms stood up. My stomach felt tight. My instincts were screaming at me, but I had no reason to feel that way. I stayed up later than usual, adding more wood to the fire, keeping it burning longer than I normally would. I told myself it was just a precaution, maybe a subconscious habit from too many nights alone in the wild. Eventually, exhaustion won. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and forced myself to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Everything was silent, too silent. I listened, barely breathing. No wind.
No insects.
No running water from the creek. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound. Leaves crunching, slow, careful. Not an animal. Someone was walking outside my tent. I froze, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The steps were light, measured, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the knife I always kept near my sleeping bag. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and deliberate. Then they stopped. Right next to me, I held my breath. My fingers tightened around the handle of my knife. Minutes passed. My ears strained for any sound, but there was nothing. No movement.
No retreating footsteps.
Just silence. I lay there, barely blinking, every muscle locked in place. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Felt like hours. Eventually, the exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, light was seeping through the fabric of my tent. Morning. I sat up slowly, my entire body stiff. My first thought was that maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe it had just been my mind playing tricks. Then, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The ground was disturbed. Footprints, human footprints, circled my tent. They weren't mine. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They came from the trees, moved around my tent, and then nothing. No footprints leading away, like whoever it was had just vanished. I packed up my camp in record time. I didn't eat, didn't stop to rest. I just stuffed everything into my pack and started hiking back toward my truck. The whole way I felt watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf made my pulse spike. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and peeled out of there, dirt kicking up behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Even now, I don't know who or what was out there. I never saw them, never heard them leave. But I know one thing, I wasn't alone. I had been planning this trip for months. A full week alone in the woods, away from everything. No phone service, no people, just me and the quiet of nature. I had done plenty of solo camping before, but this trip was different. I wanted to go deeper than ever, to a place where I was truly alone. I found the perfect spot after weeks of research. A remote patch of forest, miles from any established trails or campsites. I checked satellite images, scoured maps, made sure there were no roads anywhere nearby. I wanted isolation, and I found it. I packed everything carefully. A durable tent, a warm sleeping bag, a small camp stove, plenty of food and water, a hatchet, a knife, a fire starter. I always carried a GPS and a paper map as backup. I didn't bring a gun, I never had before. The drive took most of the day. I followed a series of winding dirt roads, each one rougher than the last, until I reached the point where the forest took over. From there, I hiked. The first few miles were easy. The air was crisp, the ground covered in a thick layer of pine needles that muffled my steps. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant sounds of traffic, no voices, nothing but the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. I found my campsite just before dusk. A small clearing near a slow-moving creek, surrounded by towering trees. The ground was flat, dry. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and built a small fire as the last light faded. I ate my meal sitting on a fallen log, watching the flames dance. That first night was uneventful. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant rustling of an animal moving through the undergrowth. Nothing out of place. I slept deeply. The next morning, I decided to explore. I followed the creek for a while, stepping carefully over moss-covered rocks, taking in the stillness of the woods. The air smelled fresh, clean. I didn't see any signs of people. No old fire pits, no footprints, no trash. I hiked for hours, eventually looping back toward camp as the sun started to dip lower in the sky. And that's when I saw it. A tree stripped of its bark. The raw wood beneath was carved with deep, uneven cuts. Not from an animal, not from weather. It was deliberate. I stood there, staring at it, feeling the first twinge of unease. I told myself it was old. Maybe someone had been here years ago. Maybe it was nothing. I walked back to camp, shaking off the feeling. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual. The woods were quieter than before. No wind, no distant animal sounds, just stillness. I went to bed, trying not to let my mind wander. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the edge of my campsite. I froze, listening. The steps circled my tent. Then they stopped. I held my breath. The silence stretched. Eventually, I must have drifted back to sleep because I woke up to daylight. Everything looked normal. The fire had burned down to embers. My gear was undisturbed. But on the edge of my camp, near the trees, I saw them. Footprints, not mine. They led from the woods, circled my tent, then disappeared back into the trees. I packed up faster than I ever had in my life. The hike back to my truck felt endless. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen. The forest was too quiet. I reached my truck by early afternoon. The door was unlocked. Inside, nothing was stolen, but the glove compartment was open, papers scattered. I started the engine, locked the doors, and drove. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced in the mirror. At the edge of the trees, someone was standing, watching. I never went back. I had always preferred hiking alone. There was something about being out there, deep in the woods with no one around, that made me feel like I had stepped outside of the world for a while. I liked the silence, the feeling of being totally untethered from the rest of my life.
No sedulis, no conversations, no expectations.
Just me, the trail, and the sound of my own footsteps. That's how I ended up hiking a remote trail in Montana late one afternoon, pushing further into the wilderness than I probably should have. I had been on a road trip for a few weeks, moving through the northern states, camping out when I could, staying in cheap motels when I couldn't. I had spent most of my time on well-traveled trails, places where I could pass other hikers every so often and feel like I wasn't completely alone. But that morning, I had stopped at a small gas station on the edge of a town I barely remember the name of, and the guy behind the counter told me about a trail a few miles out. "No one really goes up that way," he had said. "Not because it's dangerous, just kind of out of the way." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. So I drove out there, found the unmarked dirt lot he had mentioned, and set off into the woods with my pack strapped tight to my shoulders. It was perfect at first. The trail was well maintained, but clearly not heavily used. The trees were thick, towering overhead, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I could hear birds, the distant rush of a stream somewhere off to the right. Felt like I had stepped into another world. I should have turned back before it got dark. I had planned to hike out about 4 miles, then loop back before the sun set. But the trail was beautiful, and I kept pushing forward, telling myself I would turn around just after the next bend, then just after the next clearing. Before I knew it, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and I was farther from my car than I had meant to be. I wasn't worried yet. I had my flashlight, extra water, and a small knife clipped to my belt. I had hiked alone plenty of times before, even in low light. I knew what I was doing. At least I thought I did. I was about 2 miles from my car when I first noticed the silence. Not just quiet, the total suffocating absence of sound. The birds had stopped. The wind had died. Even the distant rush of the stream was gone. I stopped walking. The woods felt heavy, like they were pressing in around me. I held my breath, listening hard, trying to pick up anything. An insect buzzing, a branch creaking, my own heartbeat. Nothing. That was the first time I felt it. That slow, creeping awareness that something wasn't right. I turned my flashlight on, sweeping the beam across the trees. Everything looked the same as it had before. Just woods, just the trail, just me. But the silence lingered. I started walking again, a little faster now, my boots crunching against the dirt. It was the only sound in the world. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the forest came back to life. A bird chirped. A breeze rustled the leaves. The distant stream was there again, whispering through the trees. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Just my imagination, I told myself. Just my mind playing tricks on me. But I picked up my pace anyway. About a mile from my car, I saw the first footprint. It was right there in the dirt, just off the side of the trail. Deep, clear, recent. It wasn't mine. I stopped, shining my flashlight over it, my stomach twisting. It was a boot print, same as mine, but bigger, wider, and it was pointing perpendicular to the trail, as if someone had stepped out of the woods, paused, then stepped back in. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. I kept walking. The second footprint was even fresher. This one was right in the middle of the trail. My throat went dry. I hadn't seen anyone else out here. No one had passed me. No one should have been this deep in the woods at this hour. I swept my flashlight along the ground, looking for more prints. There were none. Just that single boot print pressed firm into the dirt. I took a step back, my body tense. My heart was beating too fast now. Then I heard it, the snap of a branch, somewhere off to my left. I swung my flashlight in that direction, my pulse hammering. The trees stood still, thick and unmoving. I waited, ears straining. Nothing. After a long moment, I forced myself to keep moving, my legs stiff, my breath tight in my chest. I was almost to the car. I just needed to get there. The last stretch of trail felt endless. I kept my flashlight low, sweeping the beam along the ground, watching for more footprints, for movement, for anything. The silence had returned, thick and absolute. Then, finally, I saw it, the dark shape of my car sitting in the dirt lot up ahead. Relief flooded me. I was almost there. And then, just as I stepped off the trail, I caught one last thing in the flashlight beam. Another boot print. This one was different. It was facing mine, like someone had been standing there, waiting, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look around. I walked straight to my car, yanked the door open, and got inside, locking the doors the second I was in. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, my headlights flooding the empty lot. Empty, but I didn't wait. I pulled out fast, my tires kicking up dust, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I didn't breathe properly until I was miles away. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know who made those footprints. Maybe it was just another hiker, though that seems unlikely. No one parks at that trailhead. No one hikes out there. It's too isolated, too empty. I keep thinking about that last footprint, the one facing mine, like someone had been standing there, waiting, and I wonder how long had they been out there, and how close had they gotten without me knowing. I was alone in the woods, far from any road or town, deep in the thick of a national forest where the trees stood like ancient walls, their trunks rough and weathered. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of the underbrush, the chirping of unseen birds, and the quiet whistle of wind slipping through the canopy. I had planned this trip for weeks. 3 days alone, just me and the wilderness. I wanted to get away from everything. The noise of the city, the stress of work, the endless notifications on my phone. I didn't bring it with me.
No GPS, no Messages, no Distractions.
Just a paper map, a compass, and a tent strapped to my back. The first day was peaceful. I hiked through miles of forest, following a winding trail that twisted through valleys and over ridges. The trees here were tall and packed tight, their branches so thick that the sunlight barely reached the forest floor in some places. When I stopped for a break, I could hear nothing but the wind and the occasional distant snap of a branch. I set up camp in a clearing beside a slow-moving creek. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones, making a soft, trickling sound. It was the perfect spot, flat ground, a good view of the surrounding woods, and easy access to fresh water. I pitched my tent, gathered wood for a fire, and settled in for the night. As the sun dipped below the treetops, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal from my pack. The flames crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the trees. The darkness in the woods beyond my little campsite was absolute. Without the fire, it would have been like staring into a void. I should have slept well that night, but I didn't. I woke up more than once to silence so deep it made my skin crawl. No wind, no insects, no distant sounds of animals moving through the brush. Just complete, suffocating silence. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like something was out there, watching. The next morning, I pushed the unease aside. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. I packed up my things and continued hiking deeper into the woods, away from the more traveled paths. I wanted to be completely alone out here. By midday, I reached a steep ridge that overlooked a dense valley. I climbed down carefully, my boots slipping slightly on the loose dirt. The air down here felt different, thicker, almost heavy. The trees grew taller, their branches twisted, their trunks covered in deep grooves. The undergrowth was dense, filled with ferns and tangled roots. As I moved through the valley, I saw something that made me stop. A tree with long, deep claw marks running down its bark. The cuts were fresh, the exposed wood still pale and raw. Some kind of animal, I figured. A bear, maybe. I moved on, keeping my eyes open for any sign of large predators. I had bear spray in my pack, but I knew that wouldn't help much if I startled something big. An hour later, I stumbled upon something stranger. A small pile of bones at the base of a tree. They were clean, white, picked dry. Too small for a deer. Maybe a rabbit, but there were a lot of them, scattered, as if something had been feeding here. I kept moving. The day passed slowly. The deeper I went, the more I noticed little things that felt off. Trees with deep gouges in the bark. Patches of ground that looked like they had been dug up. Twisted branches that seemed to have been broken recently. By late afternoon, I decided to set up camp before it got dark. I found a small clearing, pitched my tent, and built a fire. As I was gathering wood, I noticed something in the dirt nearby, a footprint. It was large, bigger than my own boot print. But what unsettled me wasn't the size. It was the shape. The front half looked normal, but the back half dragged, as if whatever made it had been limping or dragging one leg. The fire felt like a weak barrier against the vast darkness beyond its reach. As I sat beside it, I kept my ears open, listening for anything unusual. The sounds of the forest had returned, chirping insects, the occasional rustle of leaves. But every so often, I thought I heard something else. A soft shuffling, just beyond the light of the fire. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I felt exhausted, but I forced myself to pack up and keep moving. I wasn't ready to turn back yet, but something in my gut told me I needed to be more careful. I moved faster that day, hiking hard, trying to push past the feeling that I was being followed. The deeper I went, the worse it got. More clawed trees, more scattered bones, more footprints, always with that dragging gait. By the time the sun began to dip, I knew I had made a mistake going this far. I should have turned back earlier. Now I was too deep into the woods, too far from my starting point. I set up camp in a small clearing, not bothering with a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. That night, I barely moved. I lay in my tent, listening. Every sound made my heart race. At some point, I heard it again, that dragging step moving through the brush. It was slow, deliberate, closer than before. I stayed still, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. For what felt like hours, there was nothing. Then, slowly, they moved away, fading into the distance. At first light, I packed up and started back the way I came, moving as quickly as I could. I didn't stop to rest, didn't stop to eat. I just walked. Sometime in the afternoon, I reached the creek where I had camped the first night. I felt a small sense of relief. I was getting closer to the edge of the forest. That relief didn't last. On the ground near the water, something was wrong. The rocks had been disturbed, the dirt churned up, and there, in the mud, was a single deep footprint. Large, dragging. I didn't stop. I walked until my legs burned, until my lungs ached, until I finally saw the edge of the woods ahead. The sight of my truck, parked where I had left it days before, nearly made me collapse with relief. I didn't look back as I threw my pack into the truck and started the engine. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on paved roads, surrounded by signs of civilization. I still don't know what was out there. I don't want to know, but I know one thing for certain. I'll never go that deep into the woods again.